I always wondered what it felt like to be the golden child in a family, to be admired by your parents, surrounded by relatives without having to try too hard. But I never had the chance to experience that. In their eyes, I was nothing more than a shadow, a failure not good enough to be acknowledged. Meanwhile, my brother Henry was the shining star, the pride of the family, even though, in reality, he was just a braggart thriving on empty praise. We grew up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew each other's business. My reputation as the kid with no future stuck with me from an early age, while Henry was cherished like an invincible warrior. From the start, my parents placed Henry on a pedestal. He played football in high school, scored a few touchdowns, and suddenly became the pride of the entire family. And me? I was the dreamy-eyed kid who preferred books over sports competitions. My father, Richard, was the kind of man who spent his life working tirelessly but never expressed his true feelings. He woke up at 5 a.m., drove to the construction site and returned home in silence, only muttering a few grumbles if dinner wasn't ready. He never hit me, but his silence was sometimes more terrifying than words. My mother, Eleanor, was a different story. She lived by traditional values. A model mother molded by the expectations she had been taught since childhood. To her, a real son had to be strong, have a family, and succeed in the way she deemed right. And Henry was the perfect embodiment of all those standards. Henry is now in his 30s, working a steady job at a local car dealership. People still call him a successful man, an ideal role model to compare me to. He has a big house with a neatly trimmed lawn, a quiet wife named Rachel, and 2 boys who constantly run around with footballs in their hands. My family worships Henry's image, endlessly talking about his achievements as if he were some renowned politician. And me? In their eyes, I am nothing. They think I can't stand on my own, can't succeed without help. They tell me I need to try harder, to learn from my brother. But the truth is, no matter what I do, they will never acknowledge me. Even when I worked hard, saved every penny to get into college, my decision to drop out in my second year was seen as proof of my failure. I also have a younger sister, Olivia, the little princess of the family. She got married at 20 and now has 3 kids. I don't remember much about Olivia when we were younger, but when we reconnected later, I realized she was just like our parents and Henry. Olivia wasn't cruel, but perhaps to secure her place in the family, she followed their lead, treating me as a pitiful failure. Sunday dinners were the worst part of the week. I'd drive nearly 2 hours just to hear them talk about Henry, Olivia's new house, who'd just bought a new car or who got promoted. If I mentioned my job, they'd ignore it or change the subject. They still thought I worked at the old comic book store from years ago, even though it had closed down a decade ago. And Henry, as always, would pat me on the shoulder and say in that grating voice, "Mela, you need to have a plan for the future. You can't keep drifting through life like this." I'd smirk. If they knew the truth about me, maybe things would be different. But I never said anything. Because even if I did, they wouldn't believe me. I was used to being overlooked, used to being seen as a failure. But what they didn't know was that I was no longer the weak child they once dismissed. I had my own life, my own career, and my own success. They just hadn't realized it yet. My childhood wasn't filled with warm family memories or cozy gatherings around the dinner table. It was a series of endless comparisons, belittlement, and being made to feel less than. When you grow up in a family where your worth is measured against someone else's achievements, you learn one thing. No matter how hard you try, you will never be good enough. From an early age, I was different from Henry. He was strong, athletic, winning medals in school tournaments. Every time he scored in a game, my family would cheer. My father would clap him on the back with a proud smile. And me? I never got a chance to make my parents proud in that way. I had asthma, which meant I couldn't participate in sports like Henry. I hated gym class, hated the long runs outside, hated the laughter of the boys when they saw me gasping for air, my face pale as if I were about to pass out. Every time I struggled to breathe, my mother would sigh and say, "Amelia, you need to be stronger, stop making things so complicated." Stronger? No matter how much I tried to push through, in her eyes I would always be a disappointment. But perhaps the worst part wasn't the illness, it was the constant comparisons to Henry. If he was the pride, then what was I? Nothing. I wasn't great in school, not terrible, but my GPA hovered around 2.5. Not enough to impress anyone. Henry, on the other hand, wasn't a stellar student either, but he always knew how to make things seem bigger than they were. "Henry isn't just talented, he has leadership qualities," my father once said when Henry was made team captain. And me? I was just the girl sitting in the library reading comic books, dismissed as someone lost in a useless fantasy world. After high school, I tried to do what was expected of me, go to college. I paid for tuition by working part-time at a small comic book and gaming store in town. To me, it was a dream job, surrounded by things I loved, meeting people who shared my interests. But to my family, it was the perfect symbol of my failure. "Do you really want to spend your whole life working in a store that sells kids' stuff?" my mother asked as she watched me put on my uniform one evening. I didn't respond. I knew that no matter what I said, she wouldn't understand. After 2 years in college, I dropped out. I couldn't stand the uninspiring classes, the constant criticism from my family, and the feeling that I was wasting my time on something that wasn't meant for me. To my family, that was the end of the road. They never said it outright, but I saw it in their eyes. "You think dropping out was a smart decision?" my father asked coldly. "Henry has had a stable job for years, why can't you learn from him?" For the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly disappeared from the family picture. They didn't care how I felt, didn't bother to ask why I left college. All they saw was a failure. A faint shadow, not worth expecting anything from. What they didn't know was that this decision was where my life truly began. After leaving college, I continued working at the comic book store, but not just to get by. I met a friend who shared my passion for technology, and together we started a small IT company. The early days were brutal. We worked tirelessly, and there were months when we barely made any money. But we kept going. And then, everything changed. Our company grew faster than we ever expected. We landed major contracts, expanded, and within just a few years, it became a valuable business. When we sold the company to a large corporation, I walked away from the deal with a sizable sum, an amount my family could never have imagined. I could live lavishly if I wanted to, but I didn't. I didn't need a mansion, didn't need a sports car to prove anything to anyone. I bought a modest 2-bedroom home, comfortable but not flashy. I drove an old car I loved, even if others saw it as a sign of failure. They had no idea what I had accomplished. They didn't know how much money was in my bank account. Because in their eyes, I was still the useless little sister. But one day the truth would come out, and I was very curious to see how they would react when they realized that the failure they had always looked down on was actually the most successful person in the family. I had no idea how Henry managed to live with such an inflated ego without being crushed under its weight. His whole life he wore the perfect mask, the model man, the golden child, the successful older brother. But I knew the truth. Henry had never truly succeeded in the way he bragged about. He might have fooled our parents, might have convinced the whole town that he was some role model, but I had always seen the cracks in the facade he built. And then, one day, that facade crumbled. I had no idea Henry had hired a private investigator to track me. He had never hidden his contempt for me. But paying someone just to prove I was a failure? That was new. I found out by accident. One day I received an alert about unauthorized access to my credit reports. I worked in cybersecurity. I wasn't unfamiliar with the signs of a personal investigation. Someone had been digging too deep into my financial records, and I knew this wasn't a coincidence. It didn't take long to trace it back. The detective agency Henry hired wasn't careful enough to cover their tracks completely. With just a little effort, I found out who had commissioned the investigation. And when I saw Henry's name, I wasn't even surprised. He had always been searching for proof that I was a failure, but this time, he had only hurt himself. I wasn't sure how prepared Henry was to face the truth, but I was certain he didn't expect the outcome he got. Instead of uncovering that I was still the useless little sister working at some comic book shop, the investigator he hired unearthed the entire truth. I wasn't a failure. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't some loser clinging to the past. I was the co-founder of a successful tech company. I had over $1 million in assets. I owned a beautiful home in a desirable neighborhood, and most importantly, I didn't need my family's approval. Whether Henry liked it or not, the information made its way to my parents. For the first time in my life, I saw them look at me differently. Not with disappointment. Not with the constant frustration they always seemed to have whenever I showed up at family dinners. But with shock. They no longer looked at me like a daughter who needed help. They no longer saw me as an embarrassment. Suddenly, I had become someone worth noticing. "Amelia, why didn't you ever tell me about your success?" my mother asked with an awkward smile, as if she was trying to act happy for me. I shrugged. "Did you ever care?" My father, the man who had never shown much emotion, looked unsettled. He cleared his throat and nodded slowly. "You've done very well." That was probably the first compliment I had ever received from him in nearly 30 years of existence. But the most interesting reaction didn't come from my parents. It came from Henry. Henry couldn't accept the fact that I, the little sister he had always looked down on, had become more successful than him. At the next family dinner, he tried to reclaim his dignity. "My sister is very talented, but selling cars is a great career too." He folded his arms, trying to sound confident. "In fact, just last month, I sold the most expensive car at the dealership." No one reacted. My mother was still busy processing the numbers she had learned about my assets. My father remained silent as usual. And Olivia, my younger sister, simply stared at Henry without saying a word. But Henry didn't stop there. "My house was recently appraised higher than expected. And I have a solid financial plan. I might even invest in real estate." I couldn't help but laugh. He was scrambling, desperately clinging to anything that could maintain his status. I met his eyes, steady and unprovoked. "Are you sure about that, Henry?" He froze. I tilted my head. "Because from what I know, you have 3 unpaid mortgages, outstanding tax debt with the IRS, and your credit score is plummeting." The silence in the room became suffocating. Henry's fists clenched, his jaw tightened. I could see the flicker of rage in his eyes, but he couldn't do anything about it. For the first time in my life, I had a voice. And Henry knew it. No one in my family truly understood what it felt like to have your privacy violated, but I did. Henry hiring a private investigator to dig into my life wasn't just an insult. It was a clear declaration that he had never seen me as a person with real worth. To him, I was still the failure he needed to expose, so everyone would see that I wasn't worth admiring. He was wrong. And I was going to show him. I hired the same detective agency he had used to turn the tables on him. I wanted to know if Henry was as perfect as he always claimed to be. The results exceeded my expectations. When I walked into my parents' house that Sunday evening, the atmosphere in the dining room was different. My mother busied herself with the casserole, my father silently read his newspaper as usual, and Henry sat with his arms crossed, wearing a smug expression like he had just won an important game. I knew why. He thought he had won, that now that my parents knew I was wealthy, I would be pulled back into the family circle, expected to share what I had. I pulled out my chair and sat down, keeping my face neutral, but inside I was fully prepared for the storm ahead. Dinner began the same way it always did, with stories about Henry. "Your brother just hit his highest sales target this month," my mother announced proudly. "Really?" I replied with a small smile, casually placing a piece of meat on my plate. "That's impressive, Henry. Quite the achievement." Henry shot me a wary glance. I had never shown interest in his bragging before, and I was sure he sensed something different tonight. Everything went exactly as I expected. After a while, Henry couldn't hold back anymore. You know, Amelia? He leaned forward, smirking. Money isn't everything. What matters is reputation, the respect a man earns in society. I set my fork down and looked up at him. Oh? And how's your reputation doing? Henry frowned. What do you mean? I